Risk rarely announces itself with drama. In the human body, especially after 60, it tends to arrive as a gradual shift, almost polite in its subtlety. Long before a stroke becomes a medical event, it exists as a pattern quietly forming beneath awareness. Blood vessels slowly lose elasticity, pressure regulation becomes less responsive, and the nervous system adapts to years of accumulated stress as if tension were a normal baseline. None of this feels urgent in the moment. The body continues to function, to compensate, to maintain balance just well enough that warning signs are easily dismissed as aging or fatigue rather than meaningful signals. From a scientific perspective, stroke is not a sudden failure but the final expression of many small imbalances layered over time. Circulation changes subtly as vessels stiffen and blood flow becomes less efficient. The brain, which depends on precise delivery of oxygen and nutrients, begins to experience tiny disruptions that rarely cause immediate symptoms. Meanwhile, the autonomic nervous system, responsible for regulating heart rate and vascular tone, becomes biased toward alertness. Chronic stress, even when emotionally muted, keeps this system active, tightening blood vessels and elevating pressure in ways that feel normal simply because they are familiar. The body is remarkably patient in this process. It adapts to reduced flexibility in arteries, to slightly higher blood pressure, to moments of lightheadedness or mental fog that pass quickly enough to be ignored. These adaptations are not signs of weakness but of resilience. Yet resilience has limits. Over time, compensations accumulate strain, and the margin for error narrows. A stroke does not appear out of nowhere, it emerges when the system can no longer buffer against these ongoing stresses. What makes this progression particularly challenging is that the body communicates these changes quietly. Signals arrive as tension in the neck, shallow breathing, disrupted sleep, or a persistent sense of restlessness. These are not dramatic symptoms, but they are biological messages. They reflect a nervous system that has forgotten how to fully relax, blood vessels that rarely experience true softness, and circulation patterns shaped more by survival mode than by ease. The danger lies not in any single signal, but in the habit of ignoring them. After 60, the body becomes less tolerant of neglect, yet more responsive to gentle intervention. This is not contradiction, but physiology. Aging systems are slower to recover from extremes, but they respond readily to small, consistent cues that promote balance. Stroke risk, viewed through this lens, is not something to fear, but something to understand. It is the body asking for recalibration rather than rescue. Scientific research increasingly shows that prevention is rooted in regulation rather than control. Lowering stroke risk is not only about managing numbers on a chart, but about restoring rhythmic communication between the brain, the heart, and the blood vessels. When the nervous system remains locked in vigilance, circulation suffers. When it is reminded to soften, vessels respond, pressure stabilizes, and blood flows with less resistance. This is why subtle practices matter. The body listens more carefully to repeated whispers than to occasional commands. Small, intentional actions can interrupt long-standing patterns of tension before they crystallize into crisis. Recognizing stroke risk as a gradual conversation rather than a sudden event transforms how health is approached after 60. It shifts attention from fear of the future to awareness of the present, where the body is constantly offering information, waiting not to be overpowered, but to be acknowledged and guided back toward balance through signals it understands best. The ear appears simple on the surface, yet biologically it is one of the most neurologically rich gateways into the body's regulatory systems. Embedded within the outer ear are dense networks of sensory nerve endings that connect directly to the autonomic nervous system, the system responsible for regulating blood pressure, heart rhythm, digestion, and vascular tension. This is not incidental anatomy. The body places sensory receptors strategically where gentle environmental input can influence internal balance, and the ear is one of those sites where external touch can translate into internal regulation. Among these nerve pathways are branches linked to the vagus nerve, a primary communicator between the brain and the organs. This nerve plays a central role in maintaining cardiovascular stability. When vagal tone is healthy, heart rate variability improves, blood vessels relax appropriately, and inflammatory responses are moderated. As people age, vagal activity often diminishes, not because the nerve disappears, but because it is understimulated. Modern life, chronic stress, and reduced sensory variation deprive this system of the gentle cues it evolved to respond to. Scientific studies in neurophysiology have shown that light tactile stimulation of specific regions of the ear can activate these pathways without triggering a stress response. The key lies in gentleness. The nervous system distinguishes between threat and safety through intensity and rhythm. Firm pressure or abrupt touch can activate protective reflexes, while slow, intentional contact signals safety. When the ear is stimulated calmly, sensory information travels to brain centers involved in autonomic regulation, subtly shifting the balance away from constant alertness. This shift has measurable effects. Blood vessels are not rigid pipes, they are dynamic tissues wrapped in muscle and responsive to neural signals. When the autonomic nervous system leans toward sympathetic dominance, vessels constrict, blood pressure rises, and circulation becomes less efficient. Gentle ear stimulation nudges the system toward parasympathetic influence, encouraging vessels to soften and expand. This does not force blood pressure down, it allows the body to regulate itself more efficiently. Heart rhythm is influenced in a similar way. The heart responds continuously to signals from the nervous system, adjusting beat-to-beat timing in response to perceived demand. Reduced variability in heart rhythm is associated with increased cardiovascular risk. By stimulating sensory pathways linked to vagal activity, ear-based practices can support healthier rhythm modulation, creating a more adaptable cardiovascular response to daily stressors. What makes this mechanism especially relevant after 60 is that it works with the body's existing intelligence rather than against it. Aging systems often resist aggressive intervention but remain receptive to subtle guidance. The ear serves as a low-risk access point, allowing communication with deep regulatory circuits without physical strain. This is not about manipulating the body, but about reminding it of patterns it already knows. Consistency amplifies this effect. The nervous system is shaped by repetition. A brief daily signal delivered through the ear can gradually recalibrate baseline activity, reinforcing calm regulation over time. This cumulative effect is far more influential than isolated, intense efforts. The body responds to what it experiences regularly, not to what happens occasionally. Understanding the ear as a neurological interface rather than a passive structure reframes its role in health. Touch becomes information. Sensation becomes instruction. Through this lens, a simple, ear-based practice is not symbolic or alternative, but grounded in how sensory input shapes autonomic function. It offers a way to influence blood pressure and vascular tone through pathways the body naturally trusts, engaging regulation rather than resistance and supporting circulation through cooperation rather than force. As the body grows older, the nervous system becomes less tolerant of constant imbalance and more reactive to prolonged tension. Years of unresolved stress, disrupted sleep, emotional strain, and reduced physical variation gradually shape how the nervous system operates. Instead of moving fluidly between states of activity and rest, it can become biased toward vigilance. This subtle state of alertness does not feel like anxiety in the dramatic sense. It feels like tight shoulders, shallow breathing, elevated blood pressure, and a background sense of urgency that rarely fully dissolves. Over time, this constant readiness affects circulation, particularly the delicate blood flow to the brain. The autonomic nervous system governs this balance. It consists of two complementary branches, one that mobilizes the body for action and one that restores and stabilizes it. In youth, these systems shift easily. Activation is followed by recovery. With age, especially after decades of stress exposure, this flexibility diminishes. The body may remain partially activated even at rest. Blood vessels stay slightly constricted, the heart works harder than necessary, and circulation loses its natural rhythm. These changes increase vulnerability, not because the system is weak, but because it is overworked. A brief, intentional stimulation of the ear can interrupt this pattern. Sensory input delivered calmly to nerve-rich areas of the ear sends a signal that does not demand action. Instead, it communicates safety. This message travels quickly through neural pathways to brain regions responsible for autonomic control. In response, parasympathetic activity increases. Heart rate begins to slow slightly, blood vessels soften, and resistance within the vascular system decreases. Even small changes in this direction can significantly influence blood flow to the brain. What makes this effect particularly meaningful is its efficiency. The nervous system does not require long sessions or complex techniques to respond. It evolved to react to brief cues that signal changes in the environment. 15 seconds of gentle ear stimulation can be enough to initiate a shift away from chronic tension. While the effect may feel subtle, it alters the internal conditions that contribute to stroke risk by reducing persistent vascular strain. This calming response also affects how the body handles blood pressure. Rather than forcing numbers downward, parasympathetic activation improves regulation. Blood pressure becomes more responsive and less reactive. Spikes caused by stress diminish, and baseline levels stabilize. For aging blood vessels that are less elastic than before, this reduction in constant pressure is protective. It reduces wear on vessel walls and lowers the likelihood of rupture or blockage. Equally important is how this practice influences the brain's perception of safety. When the nervous system repeatedly experiences calm signals, it recalibrates expectations. The body no longer anticipates threat as readily. Muscles relax, breathing deepens, and circulation improves without conscious effort. This shift reduces the cumulative impact of daily stressors that might otherwise push the system toward instability. Over time, these brief moments of regulation add up. The nervous system learns that it can return to balance without struggle. The brain receives more consistent blood flow, and the cardiovascular system operates with greater efficiency. What began as a small sensory input becomes a pattern of improved regulation, reinforcing stability rather than tension. This is why such a simple practice holds relevance after 60. It addresses risk at the level where it often begins, not as a sudden event, but as a long-standing imbalance in nervous system regulation. By encouraging parasympathetic activity through gentle ear stimulation, the body is reminded how to soften, how to allow blood to move freely, and how to sustain internal conditions that protect the brain over time, reducing vulnerability not through forceful correction, but through a quiet return to equilibrium. What gives this practice its quiet strength is not tradition, symbolism, or complexity, but the way the nervous system responds to timing and repetition. The body does not measure impact by duration alone. It measures consistency. A signal delivered every day, even if brief, gradually reshapes baseline regulation. 15 seconds may seem insignificant to the conscious mind, but to the nervous system it is a clear, repeated instruction. Over time, these instructions accumulate, guiding the system toward steadier patterns of blood pressure control and vascular responsiveness. The autonomic nervous system is designed to learn through repetition. It adapts to what it encounters most often, not to what happens occasionally. Intense interventions performed sporadically can create short-term changes, but they rarely alter underlying regulation. In contrast, a daily practice that gently activates calming pathways reinforces parasympathetic dominance in small increments. Each repetition slightly lowers reactivity, slightly softens vascular tone, and slightly improves the body's ability to recover from stress. These changes may be too subtle to notice immediately, yet they are precisely the kind that reduce long-term stroke risk. As people age, dramatic physiological swings become harder for the body to manage. Blood vessels lose elasticity, recovery takes longer, and sudden spikes in pressure carry greater consequences. This makes consistency more valuable than intensity. A short, daily ear stimulation respects the limits of aging systems while still encouraging adaptation. It avoids overstimulation and instead promotes regulation through familiarity. The nervous system begins to expect calm input, and expectation itself becomes a stabilizing force. There is also a psychological dimension to this regularity. Knowing that a simple, manageable practice is being performed daily reduces background anxiety about health. This sense of agency lowers stress hormones that directly influence blood pressure and inflammation. The act becomes a ritual of reassurance rather than a task of correction. The body responds not only to the physical stimulus, but to the emotional context in which it is delivered. Over weeks and months, repeated parasympathetic activation influences how the cardiovascular system behaves throughout the day. Blood pressure becomes less volatile. The heart responds to demands with more flexibility. Blood flow to the brain becomes more consistent, reducing the likelihood of silent disruptions that accumulate risk. These are not dramatic shifts, but gradual recalibrations that make the system more resilient. What is often overlooked in preventive health is that the body prefers nudges over commands. It resists being forced into change but responds willingly to gentle guidance. 15 seconds, repeated daily, acts as such a nudge. It does not override natural processes, it aligns with them. This alignment allows regulation to improve without strain, making the practice sustainable rather than exhausting. Consistency also builds trust within the nervous system. Each calm interaction reinforces the message that the body is safe, supported, and not under threat. This trust reduces chronic vigilance, one of the key contributors to vascular stress. As vigilance decreases, blood vessels relax more readily, circulation improves, and the internal environment becomes less conducive to the conditions that precede stroke. In this way, the power of the practice lies not in the length of time it takes, but in the rhythm it establishes. A few seconds each day become a pattern the body recognizes and responds to, gradually shaping how the nervous system regulates pressure, flow, and recovery, demonstrating that meaningful prevention often arises not from dramatic effort, but from small, respectful actions repeated with patience and intention. As people move beyond 60, health is often framed as a battle to be fought against decline, yet the body does not experience aging as an adversary. It experiences it as a shift in priorities. Systems that once tolerated excess now require balance. Signals that were once ignored now ask to be acknowledged. In this stage of life, the most effective form of care is no longer domination, but cooperation. Small, respectful actions begin to matter more than grand efforts, and the relationship with the body becomes central to how health unfolds. Choosing simplicity over struggle is not resignation, it is intelligence. The body has spent decades adapting, learning, and compensating. It understands rhythm, repetition, and restraint far better than force. A brief, gentle practice like ear stimulation reflects this understanding. It does not challenge the body's limits, it works within them. This approach reduces resistance and invites participation from systems that might otherwise shut down in response to aggressive intervention. There is a quiet psychological shift that occurs when health practices are cooperative rather than corrective. Fear diminishes. The body is no longer treated as something that might fail at any moment, but as something capable of responding when given the right signals. This shift alone reduces stress, which is one of the most powerful drivers of cardiovascular risk. When the mind approaches the body with respect, the nervous system responds with greater stability. Listening becomes more important than doing. Subtle sensations, changes in warmth, ease, or tension, offer feedback that guides behavior. This feedback loop strengthens awareness and encourages choices that support circulation and balance throughout the day. Over time, this attentiveness influences posture, breathing, and movement patterns, all of which affect blood flow to the brain. Health becomes a continuous conversation rather than a series of isolated interventions. Small rituals carry meaning beyond their physical effect. A daily moment of care reinforces consistency and presence. It signals that health is being tended to regularly, not only when something goes wrong. This sense of continuity builds confidence, which influences how the nervous system anticipates the future. When the body expects care rather than crisis, it maintains steadier internal conditions. In later life, prevention is less about avoiding catastrophe and more about cultivating steadiness. The body thrives when patterns are predictable and supportive. Gentle practices fit naturally into this need. They do not disrupt daily life or demand recovery. Instead, they integrate seamlessly, reinforcing regulation through familiarity. This integration makes them sustainable, which is essential for long-term impact. There is also an element of dignity in this approach. Health practices that respect the body's pace honor the lived experience it carries. They acknowledge that strength does not always look like exertion. Sometimes it looks like restraint, patience, and trust. These qualities align closely with how the nervous system maintains equilibrium. As cooperation deepens, the body often responds with resilience that feels unexpected. Circulation improves, reactivity decreases, and confidence in one's physical stability grows. Stroke risk, once perceived as an external threat, becomes something addressed internally through daily alignment. The body is not being fixed or corrected. It is being supported in doing what it has always done best when given the chance, maintaining balance through subtle regulation, consistent care, and an ongoing dialogue that values understanding over urgency, allowing health to emerge not through control, but through partnership and respect.